In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a gentle old dog was simply dozing in the sunshine of his own backyard until two police officers showed up. What started as a routine check spiraled into something unfair and distressing for the defenseless dog. Yet, just when it seemed this old pup had no one to defend him, his owner burst onto the scene, turning the entire confrontation on its head. How could a loyal, elderly dog spark such upheaval, and what led these officers to cross the line? Mark Winters had spent nearly 12 years with his beloved German Shepherd mix, Duke, a grey-muzzled companion who adored warm afternoons snoozing by the garden fence. Their life in the quiet suburb seemed idyllic, the kind of peaceful existence where neighbors waved hello and the local kids rode bikes until dusk. But one fateful day, that peace was shattered. Duke, he's now considered elderly in dog years, typically spent his midday napping by a patch of sunlit grass. Mark had gone out for errands, expecting no surprises. He never imagined he'd return to find two police officers looming over his dog, voices raised, tension crackling in the air. A neighbor, hearing the commotion, peeked through a window. The sight shocked her. An old dog cowering near the fence while uniformed officers barked commands, brandishing a sense of authority that seemed disproportionate. Duke's only response was a low, pitiful whine, his tired eyes reflecting confusion and fear. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Something's happening at Mark's house. The cops are hassling his old dog. Some feared Duke was being accused of aggression or nuisance. Others worried about potential animal cruelty. By the time Mark's car pulled up, the situation appeared bleak. Duke cowered, pressed against the fence, trembling under the officer's stern gestures. What on earth had provoked this scene? According to a witness, the police had received an anonymous complaint about a dangerous dog roaming yards. Yet, Duke's cloudy eyes and unsteady legs told a different story. He barely roamed more than a few feet from his food bowl these days. Mark's heart pounded with anger and protectiveness when he saw his old friend cornered. He stepped out of his car, adrenaline coursing through him, determined to defend Duke. The officers whirled around, eyes flicking from man to dog, uncertain how Mark would respond. At that moment, the stage was set for a confrontation that would not only reveal the truth behind the call, but also challenge assumptions about loyalty, authority, and the quiet strength of an old, grey-muzzled dog who wanted nothing more than to snooze in the sun. Little did anyone suspect that what happened next would force everyone, neighbors, police, and even Mark himself, to reevaluate the line between caution and harassment, and between fear and compassion. Mark Winters could hardly believe the scene before him. His sweet old dog Duke, who spent most of his days just lying under the sun, now stood trembling in his own backyard, confronted by two uniformed police officers. Their voices were loud, overly so, Mark thought, and the tension in the air was unmistakable. Duke's muzzle was frosted with grey, and his joints had grown stiff over the years. Menacing was the last word anyone would use to describe him. Yet here he was, pressed against the fence as if cornered by a threat he didn't understand. The instant Mark stepped out of his car, the officers snapped their heads around, their eyes shifting warily between him and Duke. With adrenaline still pounding in his veins, Mark hurried across the yard. "What's going on?" he demanded, striving to keep his voice calm despite the anger rising inside him. One officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man, responded curtly, "We got a call about a dangerous dog roaming yards in the neighborhood." He kept one hand near his utility belt, which made Mark's stomach twist with worry. The officer's partner, slightly shorter, glanced at Duke with clear unease. Mark shook his head, confusion evident on his face. "Dangerous? He's old. He rarely even leaves this spot anymore." Duke let out a soft, pitiful whine, his paws scraping at the grass. This was not a dog lashing out or baring fangs. If anything, Duke was the one feeling harassed, facing two strangers in uniform who loomed over him in an aggressive posture. The entire image struck Mark as absurd and unsettling. Trying to defuse the situation, Mark approached Duke slowly. He crouched down, speaking in a soothing tone. "Hey, buddy, it's okay," he murmured. With careful strokes, he ran a hand along Duke's back, feeling the old dog's heart thumping faster than usual. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The tall officer frowned. "Sir, please step back. We need to assess this dog. We were informed he might have snapped at someone. Mark's eyes narrowed. Snapped? At who? He can barely stand on his hind legs most days. He caught sight of a neighbor, Emiska Flanagan, peeking from behind her curtain. She made a sympathetic gesture, as though to say she'd seen enough to know Duke posed no threat. A flicker of doubt crossed the shorter officer's face. We received a complaint from a neighbor about an aggressive dog barking and chasing kids. He hesitated, scanning Duke's shaky posture. Could it be a mix-up? Mark exhaled, frustration mounting. It's definitely a mix-up. Duke's never chased anyone in his life, not even a squirrel these days. Maybe you got the wrong address. The tall officer stood firm, arms crossed. We followed up on the call. The address matches. We also saw him free in the yard and responding aggressively when we arrived. Responding aggressively, Mark repeated, voice sharp. He's old and scared. You're strangers yelling at him in his own backyard. An uncomfortable silence fell. The taller officer seemed unwilling to concede a mistake, while his partner grew visibly uneasy, as though realizing the situation wasn't as reported. Mark stroked Duke's ears again, trying to calm the dog's trembling. Are you two barged into private property on a bad tip? Mark continued, forcing himself to keep steady. Now you're doubling down instead of admitting you might have been wrong. The tall officer's jaw tightened. Sir, lower your voice. His tone brimmed with authority. But underneath it, Mark sensed a hint of defensiveness. We're just doing our job. That's fine, Mark shot back, but your job also involves recognizing when there's no real threat. Look at him. He gestured at Duke, whose ribcage rose and fell in quick, anxious bursts. A neighbor from across the fence chimed in. Duke's been around forever. He's gentle as can be. Joe, sure you're not mixing him up with that new big stray that's been around. The officers glanced over, startled by the unexpected voice. Yet, none of them could see the neighbor fully. He'd chosen to speak while partially hidden behind the fence, unwilling to get too involved, but determined to defend Duke's reputation. Curiosity in a suburban neighborhood can spread like wildfire, and soon a small knot of onlookers gathered near Mark's property line. Some filmed the encounter on their phones. A few shouted opinions. He's an old dog, let him be. Or, police shouldn't harass harmless animals. The tension thickened with every passing moment. Duke, overwhelmed by the voices and stares, let out a low, mournful howl. Mark placed a reassuring hand on his dog's scruff, whispering, Hang on, buddy, we'll fix this. The older officer seemed to bristle at the growing scrutiny, his posture stiffening as though he feared losing control of the narrative. The shorter officer, noticing the shift in public sentiment, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should verify the dog's documentation, sir, he suggested, attempting a calmer tone. Proof of vaccination, licensing, and that might help clarify things. Mark nodded, wanting to de-escalate. Sure, let me grab his papers from inside. Then, with a pointed look at the tall officer, he added, But Duke's staying right here with me. You don't need to handle him. The tall officer remained stoic but stepped back grudgingly, letting Mark guide Duke toward the back door. The pair moved slowly. Duke's joints creaked with age, each step an effort. Onlookers parted to let them pass, some murmuring gentle words to the dog. Hang in there, old boy. Inside, Mark fetched Duke's vet records from a dusty folder. He felt his anger subsiding into sadness. The thought of Duke being harassed in his final years stung more than any personal insult. When he returned, the officers scanned the paperwork, verifying that Duke was fully vaccinated, microchipped, and licensed with the city. The shorter officer's eyes flicked sympathetically from the pages to Duke's trembling form. Everything checks out, he admitted. Then he met his partner's gaze, as if inviting the taller officer to concede. With pursed lips, the tall officer nodded abruptly. Looks like there was indeed a mistake. A hush fell over the yard. The crowd, phones still raised, watched for the final verdict. The tall officer exhaled a long breath, stepping forward. We apologize for the confusion, he said stiffly, though sincerity peeked through his guarded tone. We had a report of a dangerous dog. We reacted on that assumption. Mark managed a small nod. I get you're doing your job. Just next time, maybe assess the situation better before scaring an old dog half to death. The officer's jaw worked like he wanted to argue, but the presence of so many witnesses plus the dog's obvious frailty seemed to dampen his pride. Understood. With that, the two officers turned, retreating from the backyard. A few neighbors muttered disapproval under their breath. Miss Flanagan clapped softly, a mocking gesture that made the departing officers stiffen but say nothing more. Once they were gone, Mark dropped to one knee beside Duke, relief sweeping over him like a tidal wave. The old shepherd mix let out a shaky exhale and pressed his muzzle into Mark's chest. Soft murmurs of encouragement rose from those still present. Good boy, Duke, and he's safe now. But Mark couldn't shake the image of the officers looming, voices raised. Had they not been called out by the neighbors, might this situation have escalated? In that moment, Mark resolved to protect Duke with renewed vigor. Age might have stolen some of the dog's mobility, but Duke deserved dignity and peace in his own yard. Whatever had triggered the erroneous complaint and the officer's overreaction, Mark vowed never to let it happen again. If the system needed clarity on what constituted a real threat, perhaps it was time to speak up. On behalf of every grey, muzzled friend who just wanted to snooze in the sun without fear of intimidation. An unsettled quiet clung to the backyard after the officers departed. Some neighbors lingered at the fence, discussing the unsettling scene in hushed voices. Duke, still trembling slightly, pressed his muzzle against Mark's leg, as if seeking reassurance that the ordeal was indeed over. Mark bent down to rub the old shepherd's ears, feeling a wave of relief tempered by lingering anger. A wiry-haired woman in a beige coat, Mrs. Flanagan, stepped forward, concern etched into the lines of her face. "Mark, are you both okay?" she asked, her voice low. "That was intense," Mark nodded, forcing a small, grateful smile. "We're fine now. Thanks for speaking up earlier." The neighbors' quick intervention had helped diffuse the officers' aggressive stance, though the memory of their harsh voices still made Mark's stomach twist. In the corner of the yard, Mr. Leonard, a longtime resident with a cane, shook his head. "Can't believe they thought Duke was a threat. Poor dog's all bones and arthritis." Hearing that only fueled Mark's sense of injustice. "I know. He's never hurt a soul. Someone must have exaggerated or outright lied when they called the cops." By the next morning, word of cops harassing an elderly dog had circulated through the neighborhood's social media group. Posts described how the dog was cornered in his own yard, while many commented on how surprising it was that the police acted with such hostility toward a clearly non-threatening pet. Some were livid, demanding accountability from the department. Others speculated about who might have reported Duke as dangerous. Mark scrolled through these messages with conflicting emotions. He appreciated the support, but dreaded any backlash that might come from stirring up official trouble. He also wondered if the complainant was a new resident or someone with a vendetta against dogs. Dukes, meanwhile, dozed by the living room window, occasionally lifting his head to watch Mark pace. Though the immediate threat was gone, Mark found himself glancing out the window more often, alert to any sign of patrol cars. Duke, once carefree about wandering the backyard, seemed skittish. He stuck close to the house, as if afraid strangers might invade again. The dog's anxiety manifested in restless nights, pacing and whining near the back door. More than once, Mark had to get up at 2 a.m. to reassure Duke nothing was lurking outside. The entire ordeal felt wrong on many levels, prompting Mark to consider whether he should file a complaint. He'd never been anti-police. In fact, he'd always respected law enforcement. But seeing officers treat his harmless old pet like a threat rattled him deeply. Could these same officers treat another unsuspecting animal the same way? Or worse, an actual person? A few days later, Mark decided to pay a visit to the local precinct, hoping to talk things out, or at least learn why the officers had responded in such a manner. When he arrived, the front desk officer listened to Mark's brief account, then disappeared to find a supervisor. 20 minutes later, Mark was led to a cramped office where a lieutenant with tired eyes and an apologetic smile awaited him. "Mr. Winters," the lieutenant began, "we've reviewed the call logs. There was an anonymous report of a dog fitting Duke's description, supposedly growling at kids. The responding officers were following standard procedure. But based on neighbor statements, it seems like a major miscommunication." Mark nodded, tension coiling in his chest. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, but they didn't just follow procedure. They escalated quickly, cornering an old dog and yelling at him. "That's not standard." A flicker of regret crossed the lieutenant's face. "I understand, we're conducting an internal review." He paused, choosing words carefully. "It appears the call may have been exaggerated, or possibly a prank. We are taking steps to address the officer's approach." Though not entirely satisfied, Mark sensed a bit of sincerity. "I appreciate that. My concern is, Duke is traumatized. I don't want this happening to anyone else, pet or person." Meanwhile, some of the neighbors banded together to unearth who might have placed that misleading call. Mrs. Flanagan cornered Mark one afternoon, brandishing a printed map of their street. "I've asked around. None of the older residents said they phoned the police. A new family moved in 2 blocks over. Someone saw them complaining about dog barking last week. Could they be the ones?" It was speculation, but Mark felt a flicker of annoyance. If someone had overreacted to mild barking, especially an older dog's occasional groan or whine, that seemed extreme. "I guess it's possible," Mark replied. "But we can't assume. I just hope they realize the trouble they caused." Motivated by the fiasco, Mark began contemplating ways to ensure better understanding between local officers and pet owners. Perhaps the department could hold a small workshop on canine behavior, teaching officers how to distinguish between genuine aggression and a frightened or elderly dog. He discussed the idea with Mrs. Flanagan and Mr. Leonard, who both thought it might unify the community. Coincidentally, a local animal shelter staffer reached out online, offering Mark support. They shared stories of dogs wrongfully reported or seized due to misunderstandings, especially larger breeds. "We'd love to feature Duke in a short piece about older dog care," the staffer wrote. "It might help people see seniors as gentle souls." Flattered but cautious, Mark agreed to a brief interview. As the week slipped by, Duke regained some confidence in the yard, though the dog still showed signs of skittishness whenever strangers passed by. Mark devoted time each afternoon to sit outside with Duke, letting him soak up the sun again, reassuring him with gentle pets and calm words. The small lines of worry in the dog's eyes gradually softened, replaced by his usual laid-back demeanor. Yet a sense of mission grew in Mark's heart. That day in the backyard had revealed the fragility of his dog's peace, and by extension, the precarious line between caution and overreach by authorities. If one anonymous complaint could spur officers to harass a harmless senior canine, what about cases involving less visible or less fortunate pets? Before Bassi, Mark had been content to let life flow quietly. Now he considered a more proactive role, maybe advocating for clearer policies or simply sharing Duke's story with local media. He hoped that in doing so, fewer animals and fewer owners would face the same distress. At day's end, as he rubbed Duke's graying muzzle and watched the dog's tired eyes close in contentment, Mark understood that championing kindness and reason might be the best outcome of the entire ordeal. And in that gentle twilight hush, it seemed Duke agreed, one peaceful sigh at a time. Several weeks passed since the unsettling confrontation in Mark Winters's backyard. Duke, the elderly German Shepherd mix, had mostly recovered his confidence, no longer flinching each time he heard unfamiliar footsteps near the fence. Mark, on the other hand, remained uneasy. He'd tried to move forward, focusing on his work and the rhythms of daily life. Yet a nagging curiosity about who had called the police in the first place kept gnawing at him. One crisp morning, Mark retrieved his mail and found a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a typed note. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant for the police to treat your dog so harshly. I just wanted help with a stray that's been scaring my kids. It's all gone too far. Please understand." His mind raced. Who wrote this? The simplest guess was that it was from the neighbor rumored to have placed the complaint. But if this person truly hadn't intended to target Duke specifically, how had everything escalated? Mark reread the note. The words felt both apologetic and defensive, hinting they still believed there was a legitimate concern about a stray, but it didn't clarify why the call had led police to his property or how the situation spun out of control. At least they're remorseful, he thought. Duke is sniffing the corner of the envelope, let out a soft huff as if unimpressed. A few days later, Missy Flanagan stopped by while Mark was raking leaves in his front yard. I heard from the Jones family down the road. They said they saw a large, mangy-looking stray prowling around the alley last night, she remarked. Could that be the dog your neighbor mentioned? Maybe that's who the police were really looking for. Mark paused, leaning on the rake. If so, it means the call might have been genuine. The caller must have confused Duke with that stray. But why didn't they at least verify it before barging into my yard? Mrs. Flanagan shrugged, sharing his frustration. Either way, there's definitely another dog out there, and it's probably not old and gentle like Duke. That evening, Mark found himself sitting on the back porch, pondering the idea of a stray that might indeed be aggressive. If a large dog was roaming and scaring kids, he empathized with the concerned parent. Duke snored softly at his feet, oblivious to the swirl of emotions in Mark's mind. If only we could have sorted this out calmly, Mark thought. Instead, a simple complaint had escalated into a near tragedy for his old friend. Just then, a sound from beyond his fence, a muffled growl or bark, caught his attention. Duke's ears twitched, but he didn't stir otherwise. Rising to investigate, Mark peered over the fence. In the dim glow of a nearby street lamp, he glimpsed a lean, shadowy canine shape slipping behind a trash bin. The dog, if it was indeed a stray, disappeared almost instantly when it sensed Mark's presence. The next morning, Mark paid a visit to the local animal shelter, determined to learn more about the rumored stray. A volunteer there, a young man named Peter, recognized Mark's face from the local social media chatter about Duke's ordeal. We've had a few calls about a large, possibly aggressive stray matching that description, Peter said. He's known to roam the alleys at night. Folks have seen him near your block, scavenging from trash cans. Mark's thoughts turned back to the typed letter. Perhaps it truly was just a case of mistaken identity. The neighbor, frightened for their children, called the police. The cops showed up, found an old shepherd in a yard, and jumped to conclusions. A tragic miscommunication, he mused, inwardly relieved that no malicious intent seemed to target Duke specifically. But it also filled him with sympathy for whoever wrote that letter. Fear can make people act rashly. Back at home, Mark emailed an update to a small group of neighbors who'd been discussing the issue. He suggested they coordinate, keep an eye out for the stray, maybe reach out to local rescue groups so the dog could be caught humanely and rehomed instead of feared or shot by alarmed residents. To Mark's surprise, within a couple of hours, his inbox flooded with supportive replies. Miss Flanagan wrote, "Count me in. If we can set up a humane trap or even just feed it in a safe spot, we can help it." Another neighbor, Mr. Leonard, offered to set up a motion-activated camera near his trash cans. The community seemed eager to avoid another fiasco. Meanwhile, Peter from the shelter reached out with a discovery. A dog matching the stray's description had been reported missing by a family in a neighboring town months ago. He emailed a grainy photo, indeed, a large shepherd mix with ragged fur, anxious eyes. This dog's name was apparently Scout, once belonging to a single mother who had to relocate for work. The dog escaped a boarding arrangement and vanished. The mother, desperate, had posted flyers no one seemed to notice. That same day, Mark showed the photo to Ms. Flanagan and a few others. They nodded emphatically. It looked just like the animal rummaging through their alleys. Could Scout have ended up in their suburb by chance, living off garbage? The idea tugged at Mark's conscience. We can help the dog instead of labeling him dangerous. The neighbor's fear might be real, but it doesn't mean lethal force is the answer. That afternoon, a knock on Mark's door jolted him from his thoughts. Opening it, he found himself face to face with one of the officers who had confronted Duke. Not the tall Mike Stern one, but the shorter officer who seemed more hesitant that day. The man looked uneasy but determined. "I want to apologize properly," the officer said, removing his cap. "We got the call about a dangerous dog, but I realize we overreacted in your yard. That was never our intention. Sometimes we respond to a perceived threat too aggressively." Though Mark's anger simmered, he appreciated the attempt at a genuine apology. He invited the officer in for a brief conversation, offering coffee while Duke observed from his spot on the rug. The officer confessed the police department had been on high alert for roaming aggressive dogs after a recent incident in another district. "We jumped to conclusions," he admitted, glancing at Duke. "I'm truly sorry." After a pause, Mark shared the rumor of the real stray dog, Scout, and the plan to capture him safely. The officer's eyes brightened with interest. "I can put you in touch with animal control. Maybe we can set up a safe trap. We don't want to see any dog get hurt." They talked well into the evening, forging a new understanding. Where once Mark felt only resentment, he now saw an officer who regretted mistakes and was willing to help correct them. As the officer left, Duke watched from the door, tail wagging gently, as if sensing the tension had softened. That night, Mark sat in the backyard again, gazing at the star-flecked sky. Duke lay by his feet, muzzle resting on Mark's shoe. The typed letter, the rumored stray, the supportive neighbors, and now the apologetic officer. Everything pointed to a chance for real change, at least in this corner of the suburb. A chance for compassion to triumph over fear, for cooperation to replace aggression. He'd see how it all played out in the coming days, but for now he scratched Duke's ears, feeling the old dog sigh contentedly, and allowed himself a bit of hope. Perhaps the biggest revelation was that, when faced with misunderstanding and fear, people could still choose decency, bridging the gap between anxious callers, cautious police, and a community that loved its pets. Duke, half asleep, snored softly, maybe dreaming of a world where no old dog would ever again be harassed in his own backyard. Morning light spilled across Mark Winters's living room floor, illuminating Duke sprawled out in a patch of warmth. The elderly shepherd Mick slept soundly, his legs twitching as if chasing a dream squirrel. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a faint optimism that maybe their quiet life could return to normal. Only this time with a renewed sense of purpose and neighborly collaboration. Following the apology from the police officer and the revelation of the stray dog's true identity, Scout, Mark found himself at the heart of a blossoming neighborhood initiative. A small group of residents, Miss Flanagan, Mr. Leonard, and a few others, convened in Mark's backyard for an informal town hall of sorts. Over folding chairs and lukewarm lemonade, they plotted ways to safely capture Scout before he got into more trouble. "I spoke to a rescue group, Ms. Flanagan announced, waving her phone excitedly. "They're willing to lend us a humane dog trap. If we can lure him with food, they'll come pick him up and foster him until the owner from that other town can be contacted." Mr. Leonard, leaning on his cane, nodded. "We also have the officer who confronted Duke offering to help. Surprising turn of events, but I guess he feels bad." He shot Mark a meaningful look. "Glad to see some good come out of that fiasco." Mark ran a hand through his hair, glancing down at Duke, who gazed sleepily at the group as if to ask, "Are we having another crisis?" "Yeah, if it means no more dogs get misidentified and harassed, I'm in," Mark said. Deep down, he hoped capturing Scout might also bring closure to the confusion that had nearly cost Duke his peace. The next day, Mark received a call from that same apologetic officer, Officer Reed, who had realized the misunderstanding about Duke. "We got word from Animal Control. They'd like us to assist setting up the trap near your block, in case Scout's still lurking." His tone was professional, yet tinged with a personal note, like he felt he owed Mark a proper resolution. Mark agreed, though he couldn't help but recall how only recently he'd bristled at the mere sight of a patrol car near his yard. Now, ironically, these same officers would stand guard for a dog in need. The shift in dynamic wasn't lost on him. That evening, a small crew gathered behind Mark's backyard fence where sightings of Scout had been reported. They erected a large humane trap, a metal enclosure with a drop door that would seal once the dog stepped inside. Miss Flanagan contributed leftover roast chicken, setting it on a paper plate as bait. One of the rescue volunteers explained, "He's likely hungry and suspicious of people. We need him to enter willingly, then we can safely transport him." Duke, kept at a distance, watched with mild confusion. Maybe he sensed they were doing something dog-related, but couldn't quite figure out what. Mark patted Duke's head. "Don't worry, bud. We're making sure no one mistakes another dog for you again." Officer Reed stood by, occasionally shining a flashlight along the alley. "If we can't catch him tonight, we'll try again tomorrow," he said. "But from what we've heard, he tends to patrol these trash cans after midnight." As the sun dropped, volunteers took shifts peering out windows or huddling near the trap. Mark even rigged a spare camera to monitor the site from his phone. The quiet suburb at night felt strangely unified by this mission, reminiscent of simpler times when neighbors collectively protected their own. Sure enough, around 11 p.m., Mark's phone pinged with a motion alert from the camera feed. Scout, a lean silhouette in the alley, crept toward the bait. Heart pounding, Mark rushed outside, meeting Miss Flanagan and Reed behind the fence. They watched from a respectful distance as the dog sniffed the air, obviously ravenous, yet cautious. Slowly, the stray inched forward, muzzle low, ears twitching at every faint sound. For a moment, it seemed he'd enter the trap. But then a distant car door slammed. Scout bolted, vanishing into the darkness before the drop door triggered. Reed let out a frustrated sigh. And Miss Flanagan shook her head. He's spooked. We'll try again tomorrow or the next night, she murmured. They dismantled the bait, leaving the trap in place with fresh food. Sometimes, capturing a wary stray could take days or even weeks. The following afternoon, Mark received a call from the woman who'd posted about a missing dog named Scout. She introduced herself as Linda from a nearby town. I heard your group is trying to catch a big shepherd mix. Could it be my Scout? He escaped months ago. Her voice brimmed with both hope and worry. Mark described the sightings and the approximate size, coat color. Linda nearly cried with relief, sure it was her dog. He's probably terrified, she said. He was always skittish around strangers, especially men. Please, I'll come help, just tell me where and when. Mark arranged for Linda to drive over that night. If Scout recognized her scent, maybe the stray wouldn't flee. That evening, as neighbors set up once again, Linda arrived in a dented sedan. She carried an old blanket Scout used to sleep on. The plan was simple: line the trap with the blanket so Scout might feel secure. The tension was palpable. Would tonight be the night they finally helped the poor stray? Mark felt a familiar anxiety pinch his gut as the group reassembled. Duke dozed inside the house, spared from another night of watchers and potential confrontation. Officer Reed, off duty now, showed up in civilian clothes, wanting to see it through. They took up positions again, cameras rolling, hearts pounding. Shortly before midnight, a rustling in the brush announced Scout's approach. Linda crouched behind a trash bin, her breath quivering. The dog emerged, coat ragged, eyes gleaming with caution. As soon as Scout sniffed the blanket's scent, his posture shifted from alarmed to uncertain curiosity. A hush fell among the watchers. Careful not to make sudden moves, Linda gently called, "Scout, boy, is that you?" Her voice was thick with emotion. The dog froze, ears perked. Then, in a breath-catching moment, Scout took a trembling step forward. Another, and another. He nosed the blanket, tail twitching in confusion, but also recognition. A whimper escaped him, low and heartbreakingly vulnerable. Linda, tears slipping down her cheeks, inched forward, letting Scout catch her scent fully. Then the stray, no longer a stranger, mustered enough trust to step closer. The watchers held their breath. Slowly, Linda reached out, hand trembling, and Scout licked her palm. A hush of awe rolled through the group. Under the faint moonlight, the dog at last allowed himself to be gently coaxed into the open cage. The drop door slid down with a click, but this time it wasn't the sound of entrapment. It was the signal that Scout was, finally, safe. Linda sobbed softly, pressing her hand through the bars to stroke his matted fur. Even Officer Reed stood by with misty eyes. In that moment, Mark realized the direct link between Duke's ordeal and Scout's rescue. If not for the misguided call that nearly spelled trouble for Duke, the neighborhood might never have banded together to save the real stray. Fate, in its odd, indirect way, had steered them here. Mark exhaled, a wave of relief and gratitude rising in him. Duke's innocence had been proven, and another dog, frightened and misunderstood, would now find his way back to a loving home. The capture of Scout had brought a welcome calm to the neighborhood. People who had anxiously peered outside each night for the lurking stray could finally leave scraps of trash or let their pets roam the yard without fear. Even so, the story was not over. Word of how Duke had been mistaken for a dangerous dog, and how a genuine stray named Scout was eventually found, was spreading through local media circles. Neighbors who'd once never spoken were now chatting over fences, sharing updates on both dogs. The day after Scout was caught, Linda, the dog's former owner, came to pick him up from the local rescue. A small crowd of neighbors and volunteers gathered in the rescue center's lobby, watching as Linda approached the exhausted, timid shepherd mix. She crouched low, calling his name softly. There was an audible gasp when Scout recognized her scent, tail giving a hesitant wag. Tears glistened in Linda's eyes as she thanked Mark and the others who had worked to ensure Scout's safety instead of letting him roam until something worse happened. "I was desperate when I lost him," she confided. "I never imagined he'd travel all the way here and cause so much trouble by accident." Mark shook her hand warmly. "He's no trouble. I'm just glad we figured it out before the police or someone else made a mistake." He thought of Duke trembling in the backyard and how close the entire incident had come to ending in tragedy. As Mark guided Linda through the rescue center, Detective Reed, the officer who'd apologized, stepped in to observe. He'd been assigned to follow up on the final details of the stray dogs case. Seeing Linda and Scout's tearful reunion, his gaze softened. To Marky, it was clear that Reed wasn't the callous enforcer. Some might have painted him as during the backyard confrontation. He'd simply been doing his job, albeit too aggressively at first. "It feels good to see a happy ending," Reed muttered, almost to himself. Mark caught the remark and offered a nod. "Better than cornering an old dog who did nothing wrong," he said gently, not to dredge up blame, but to underline how far they'd come. Reed grimaced, returning a small smile. "I won't forget that day," he admitted. "I guess we all learned something." Duke, for his part, had become something of a local celebrity. The story of how an elderly dog got mixed up in a police fiasco and how it led to saving a real stray had been picked up by a regional TV station. One afternoon, a reporter showed up at Mark's front door, cameraman in tow, politely asking for an interview. Mark hesitated, uncertain if he wanted the attention. But then he glanced at Duke, snoozing contentedly, and realized that shining a light on the issues, misidentifications, the risk of overzealous responses, might help others avoid similar incidents. During the brief interview, Mark found himself explaining how close Duke was to being hurt by scared or aggressive officers simply because of a call that never specified the correct dog. He stressed the importance of verifying complaints and treating animals and their owners with empathy before escalating a situation. When asked what he hoped would change, Mark simply said, "I'd like folks to ask questions first and let fear take a back seat." Shortly after, Captain Ellis from the local police station reached out to Mark. He wanted to create a small training module for officers that included basic canine body language and recommended steps to follow up on dog-related calls. "We can't rely solely on outdated protocols," Ellis said during a phone call. "Your story with Duke put a spotlight on how easy it is to make assumptions." Mark welcomed the idea. "If you need my or Duke's help, let me know." He pictured Duke standing in a station briefing room, old tail wagging as officers learned how to read a dog's posture or interpret a whine versus a growl. The mental image warmed his heart, a small step toward ensuring no other docile pet ended up cornered and terrified. Detective Reed also seemed keen on this. He privately confided to Mark, "I'd feel better if the next time we respond to a dog complaint, we use a calmer approach. No one wants a tragedy on their conscience." As a gesture of unity, Misty Flanagan organized a weekend neighborhood potluck in Mark's backyard. Yes, the same place where Duke's ordeal began. The vibe was markedly different now. The fence was decorated with ribbons, a picnic table overflowed with home-cooked dishes, and children played tag while the older folks sipped iced tea. Even the officer Reed dropped by off duty to say hello. Duke lay on a blanket near the porch, contentedly soaking in the social bustle. Whenever someone new arrived, they'd kneel down and offer gentle pats or ear scratches. Among them was Linda, who came with Scout in tow, kept on a leash, but much calmer than before. The two dogs sniffed each other politely. Duke offered a low woof, as if welcoming the younger dog into his domain. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, Mark surveyed the mingling crowd. Neighbors chatting, children giggling, two dogs, one old, one once lost, both lying peacefully under the same sky. The irony was not lost on him that an error so frustrating had led them all to a deeper sense of community. Without that complaint, They might never have banded together to rescue Scout, nor spurred the police to rethink how they handle dog-related calls. Mark stooped to give Duke a gentle rub on the muzzle. The dog's cloudy eyes glimmered with contentment. "We did okay, didn't we, old boy?" he whispered. Duke responded with a soft huff, shifting to rest his chin on Mark's knee. A quiet hush fell over the yard, laughter and chatter softening to gentle murmurs. Some folks were packing up their leftovers, while others lingered. Mark's chest filled with gratitude. Through fear and misunderstanding, a new sense of compassion and collaboration had blossomed. As evening lights flickered on, Mark felt that in a small but meaningful way, Duke's story had opened doors of empathy, neighborliness, and better training for officers who might respond to the next dog complaint differently. And in that moment, the once harsh backyard glowed with a warmth of acceptance, proof that even in the face of mistakes and scare tactics, good people and good dogs can steer a community toward unity and kindness. Autumn leaves swirled across Mark Winters's backyard, the same space that had seen so much upheaval just a few weeks before. Duke, the elderly shepherd mix, slowly nosed through the grass, careful and deliberate with each step, as if remembering he was once cornered here by officers who mistook him for a dangerous dog. But those days felt distant now, transformed by the neighborly potluck and the rescue of the real stray Scout. Life had almost settled back into its gentle pace. Yet, despite the newfound peace and communal goodwill, Mark couldn't shake a quiet undercurrent of anxiety. Something about the entire fiasco with the police still felt unresolved. Yes, an officer had apologized, the department had pledged to reform how they handle animal calls, and the neighborhood had united. But was it enough? A part of Mark worried that if another misleading call came in, or if a different set of officers responded, old dogs like Duke could still be at risk. He found himself glancing over his shoulder whenever a patrol car cruised by the block. Duke sometimes paused and blinked at the sight, as if recalling the day uniforms invaded his sunny nap spot. Mark would let out a calming breath, telling himself, "They know better now. We all do." But the feeling of vulnerability remained. One crisp afternoon, Mark received a phone call from the local animal shelter. A cheery voice introduced herself as Melissa, the shelter's community outreach coordinator. She'd heard about Duke's ordeal and the story of Scout's rescue. Now she wanted to collaborate with Mark on a small awareness event for the area, possibly featuring a short demonstration of dog-friendly policing with the newly retrained officers. "It's about bridging the gap," as she said, "showing folks that not every complaint about a dog has to end in panic. We'd love to involve Duke, if he's comfortable, as a sort of ambassador for senior pets. And maybe the police department can send an officer or two to discuss what they learned." Mark's heart lifted at the idea. If it could prevent another dog from facing the same stress Duke endured, it was worth it. "I'm in day," he agreed, imagining a day of stalls, pamphlets, maybe even a mini workshop on reading canine body language. Just as long as Duke won't be overwhelmed. He's not exactly a puppy these days. After that phone call, Mark reached out to Officer Reed, the policeman who'd shown remorse and later helped catch Scout, to see if the department would formally participate in the event. Reed was surprisingly enthusiastic. "We've actually started a new training segment for rookies on handling pet calls," he explained over the phone. "We might be able to do a short demonstration, show how to approach a dog calmly, use non-threatening posture. So I think it's a great idea." Still, Reed warned Mark that not all officers were equally on board. Some felt the department had been unfairly criticized for just doing their job, and they might view such an event as a forced apology. Mark sighed, recalling the tension during the potluck where a few uniformed folks had hovered with guarded expressions. "If it helps even a few officers or neighbors, it's worth a try," he said. A week later, Mark visited the precinct in person for the first time since lodging his informal complaints. Stepping inside, he felt a subtle hush descend. A few officers recognized him as the dog man, casting curious or sympathetic glances. Perhaps they recalled the public outcry or the local news coverage that followed the misidentification of Duke. Spotting Reed near a bulletin board, Mark offered a friendly nod. "Glad you came," Reed said, extending a handshake. "We just had a meeting about the outreach event." He pulled out a piece of paper listing possible demonstration points: calm approach, reading dog signals, verifying reports thoroughly and clarifying the difference between a truly aggressive dog and one that's just barking or anxious. Mark scanned the list, a small smile forming. This is good. If we had this knowledge in place weeks ago. He trailed off, not wanting to dredge up negativity. But Reed nodded grimly, finishing the thought for him. Then we wouldn't have traumatized your old friend. That same afternoon, Mark took Duke to the vet for a routine senior checkup. Given the dog's recent stress, it seemed prudent. Dr. Menendez, the longtime family vet, was relieved to see that Duke's heart rate and weight hadn't deteriorated. He's a tough old boy, Dr. Menendez said, patting Duke's flank. The stress might have given him a few sleepless nights, but physically, he's holding up. Just keep an eye on those joints. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So he's good to go for a small public event in a few days. The vet chuckled. If it's not too overwhelming, sure. Just watch for signs of fatigue. And if he wants to lie down, let him. As Mark left the vet's office, his phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unknown number. He hesitated but answered. A woman's voice, nervous, halting, introduced herself. Hello, I'm the one who wrote you that letter. The mother who called the police about a dangerous dog. Mark froze, heart thudding. This was the first time speaking directly to her. He managed. Thank you for reaching out. She sighed audibly. I'm truly sorry. My kids were scared by a big dog in the alley, and I guess Duke fit the description. I never expected the cops to be so aggressive. I wanted to come see him, apologize in person. Her voice quivered with regret. Conflicted feelings surged in Mark's chest, anger, empathy, relief. All right, he said gently. If you really want, we can meet. Duke's older, but he's friendly. I'd like to clear the air. Arranging a meeting at Mark's yard, ironically the scene of the fiasco, set his nerves on edge. Would she be standoffish, or would she truly express remorse? Did she have an explanation for how the situation escalated? The neighborly potluck had glossed over the source of the call, and while many guessed the new family on the block, confirmation was absent. As the day approached for both the outreach event at the shelter and this personal meeting, Mark found himself cycling between tension and cautious hope. If this mother truly never intended harm, maybe bridging their misunderstanding could bring final closure for Duke's ordeal. Ms. Flanagan, hearing the news, offered to stand by if moral support was needed. And if she tries to blame you again, we'll set the record straight, she added, winking. Duke, for his part, carried on as if life had never been disrupted. He'd nap, stretch out in a sunbeam, and occasionally amble toward the fence to greet passers-by with a wag of his tail. Mark patted his old friend's side, taking comfort in the dog's unshakable calm. We'll get through this final chapter, buddy, he thought. Then maybe we can really rest easy. The sun hung low over Mark Winters's backyard on the afternoon he'd agreed to meet the anonymous caller. A young mother who'd mistakenly reported Duke as a dangerous dog. She had only identified herself briefly as Michelle on the phone, her voice tense yet earnest. Now Mark stood near the fence, trying to steady his breathing. This was the same spot where officers once cornered Duke to, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Duke, for his part, remained inside the house for the moment. Though Mark wanted him nearby, he wasn't about to force the elderly shepherd mix into another anxious scene if tensions ran high. Misty Flanagan and Mr. Leonard had volunteered to be around just in case, quietly stationed in their yards, prepared to step in or provide moral support. Detective Reed was also aware of the meeting, though he'd politely refrained from attending in uniform, trusting Mark to handle it unless something went wrong. At precisely 4 o'clock, a silver sedan rolled up in front of Mark's house. A woman in her early 30s emerged, glancing around nervously as she closed the car door. She wore a hoodie and clutched a small purse against her side. Mark waited at the open gate, giving a polite nod. "Michelle?" he asked softly. She managed a shaky smile. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for letting me come." Her eyes flicked to the patch of yard behind Mark, as if half expecting to see the dangerous dog from the complaint. Seeing no sign of Duke, her shoulders relaxed a bit. They exchanged small pleasantries. Mark introduced himself, gave a brief mention of how Duke was doing, and gestured to the yard's chairs. Michelle took in the carefully mowed grass and the unassuming setting, her gaze heavy with regret. Finally, she offered a single sentence that seemed to carry everything. "I'm sorry it turned out the way it did." Settling into the folding chairs, Mark noticed Michelle's restless posture, knees bouncing, fingers twisting at her purse strap. She inhaled sound, then spoke in a rush. "I only moved here a few months ago. My kids kept seeing a large dog near the alley, barking aggressively. They got spooked. I asked neighbors, but nobody seemed to know who it belonged to. So I panicked and called the police." Her voice trembled with residual guilt. Mark nodded, recalling how that stray scout indeed roamed the alleys back then. "So you reported a big, threatening dog. The officers show up, find my old Duke instead of the real stray. And, well," he shrugged, letting the memory of that confrontation speak for itself. Michelle's cheeks reddened. "I never intended them to act like that. I assumed they'd just check around, maybe talk to owners. Next thing I know, I'm hearing that they cornered an old dog and traumatized everyone involved. Then the story spread, and I felt horrible. That's why I wrote that letter." Mark listened, arms folded loosely across his chest, empathy and frustration mingling within him. "I get why you were scared for your kids," he said gently, "but the officers didn't handle it calmly. Duke was pinned down, basically harassed. He's never been the same around strangers in uniform." He paused, letting that sink in. "I appreciate your apology, though. This means a lot." Michelle's eyes glistened with tears. "I saw news about your dog being innocent, how he's old, arthritis and all. It broke my heart imagining him trembling in his own yard. I just hope you can forgive me. I honestly didn't know it'd blow up like that." She wiped at her cheeks, relieved to see Mark's posture soften. Sensing the conversation might benefit from meeting the dog in question, Mark rose. "Would you like to see Duke? He's inside. I think it might help to show you who he really is, just a sweet old guy." Michelle swallowed, nodding hesitantly. Mark opened the back door, calling gently, "Duke, come on, buddy." A moment passed before Duke ambled forward, tail wagging at half-mast. He padded across the threshold, sniffing the air. Catching sight of a stranger, the dog paused, uncertain, but Mark stroked his shoulder reassuringly. "It's okay, boy." Michelle's eyes widened at the dog's slow gait and graying muzzle. "He's really not what I pictured." She extended a tentative hand. Duke leaned in, giving it a cautious lick. Tears pricked at her eyes again. "I can't believe the police thought you were a threat," she whispered to Duke, voice thick with remorse. Behind the fence, Ms. Flanagan and Mr. Leonard exchanged relieved glances, overhearing the calm conversation. No shouting match, no blame game. The mother's contrition seemed genuine, and Mark's willingness to forgive echoed in the subdued tone of their discussion. A sense of closure began to settle across the yard, something Mark had quietly craved since that day. Michelle knelt, letting Duke sniff her face before giving him gentle rubs behind the ears. "I wish I'd just knocked on doors, asked around, found out you had an older dog." She sighed. "Fear makes people do rash things. We hear about dog attacks on the news, and we assume the worst." Mark crouched beside them, resting a hand on Duke's back. "Sometimes we forget to differentiate real threats from perceived ones. The stray that was scaring your kids, he turned out to be someone else's missing dog. He was just lost and hungry." He briefly recounted how they'd found Scout and reunited him with his owner. Michelle's eyes shone with wonder and regret. Wonder at the story's happy end, regret at how fear escalated everything. Standing, Mark offered a small smile. "I'd like us to move forward, maybe help spread the word about verifying dog complaints, or encouraging neighbors to talk before dialing 911. I can't change what happened, but we can prevent future misunderstandings." Michelle nodded vigorously. "I agree. Perhaps I can speak to the new folks on our street. Let them know about the local rescue, the shelter's methods. We don't have to rely on drastic measures." Before leaving, Michelle mustered the courage to rest a hand gently on Duke's head once more. "I'm so sorry, Duke," she said, voice quavering. The dog blinked, tail giving a faint wag as though to accept her contrition. Mark guided her to the gate, the weight of tension lifting from his shoulders. He couldn't fault her for wanting to protect her children, but at least now they understood each other on a human level. As the gate latched behind Michelle, Mrs. Flanagan poked her head over the fence, smiling. "All good?" Mark grinned. "All good," he confirmed. Duke, seemingly sensing the atmosphere, let out a contented huff, as if relieved to see so many potential threats dissolve into friendship. Inside, Mark collapsed onto the couch, Duke hopping up beside him, an old dog who once again found his yard free of aggression or confusion. It wasn't that the memory of that day vanished, rather it was put to rest by mutual respect, a mother's contrition, and the realization that fear could be undone by empathy. And as the evening sunlight danced across the living room floor, Mark felt a quiet gratitude that Duke could finally enjoy his twilight years with peace, and maybe even a few new friends. In the weeks following Michelle's heartfelt apology, the mood in Mark Winters' neighborhood felt almost rejuvenated. Conversations about that old dog Duke and the stray named Scout gradually gave way to everyday chatter about gardening or the local school's upcoming festival. And yet, even as daily life settled, a quiet determination smoldered in the community. No one wanted another innocent dog or owner to experience what Duke had gone through. Detective Reed, who had grown close to the situation, remained true to his word about improving how officers handle animal complaints. One afternoon, he reached out to Mark with an unexpected invitation. "We're holding a small training session at the precinct for new recruits," Reed explained on the phone. "I'd love for you and Duke to show up, if he's up for it. Let them meet a real senior dog in the neighborhood. It might open their eyes to reading canine behavior before jumping to conclusions." Mark hesitated, picturing Duke among a room full of uniformed strangers. But the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. If we can help them see how calm and gentle an old dog can be, they won't assume the worst next time. So, with a mixture of pride and lingering nerves, Mark accepted. They arranged a date the following week. Concerned about Duke's comfort, Mark booked a brief vet appointment to ensure the old shepherd mix was healthy enough for an outing to the police station. Dr. Menendez welcomed them warmly, giving Duke a once-over, checking his joints, heart rate, and any signs of stress. "All looks well," the vet said, scratching behind Duke's ears. "He might get a bit anxious with too many new people, so keep your visit relatively short, and let him rest if he shows any sign of fatigue." Mark exhaled a breath of relief. "We'll keep it brief, then." Just enough to make a positive impact. Word spread quickly among the neighbors. Duke and Mark were going to the precinct for a special demonstration. Ms. Flanagan applauded the idea, clapping her hands excitedly. "I wish I could see the looks on the rookies' faces," she exclaimed. "They'll realize not every dangerous dog call is legit." Meanwhile, Mr. Leonard grinned. Maybe this'll stop them from jumping fences and shouting at every stray bark. Even Michelle, the mother who initially triggered the fiasco, offered encouragement. "You're doing a good thing," she said quietly to Mark. "I'm relieved to see the police taking steps to learn instead of doubling down on aggression." On the day of the demonstration, Mark loaded Duke into his car, ensuring he had water, treats, and a comfy blanket for the old dog. The station's parking lot bustled with patrol cars, and a few onlookers curious about the unusual visitor. Detective Reed met them at the entrance, wearing a welcoming smile. "Thanks for coming," he said, giving Duke a gentle pat. "We've got a briefing room set up." Inside, a small group of young officers waited, some exchanging skeptical glances, others showing open curiosity. At the front, a projector screen displayed slides, approaches to animal calls, distinguishing true threats from misidentification. Mark felt a twinge of nervousness, but the moment he looked at Duke, wagging his grey tail, it subsided. Reed introduced Mark and Duke, recounting a short version of the backyard incident, how a wrong assumption led to an overzealous response, traumatizing an elderly dog who posed no real threat. Some recruits looked uncomfortable as they realized how easily such mistakes could happen. Mark demonstrated Duke's signals, how the dog's posture was relaxed, tail mid-height, ears not pinned back. He might bark at a stranger, but notice his body language, no baring of teeth, no lunging. He's simply an old dog defending his yard. Then Mark imitated the scenario, an officer approaching too quickly, shouting commands. Duke flinched, eyeing the uniform with uncertainty. "That's how we met," Mark quipped with a rueful smile. A few recruits chuckled softly, though their smiles were laced with guilt. Reed chimed in many calls, verifying the dog's behavior before escalating is crucial. A real sign of aggression might include snarling, hackles raised, stiff posture. But if all you see is a trembling or confused dog, use your voice calmly, keep non-threatening body language, and always confirm the dog's condition. Older dogs often can't run or attack the way you might assume. A hand shot up from the back row, a young officer with a buzz cut. "Sir? What if we can't tell if the dog is truly old or just feigning submission? Could it still be dangerous?" Mark gently coaxed Duke to approach. The dog sniffed the officer's outstretched hand, tail giving a half-hearted wag. "You can't always be sure," Mark admitted. "But that's why you approach with caution, not aggression. This old fella can barely trot across the yard, let alone mount an attack. A few seconds of observation can clarify a lot." The officer gave Duke a soft pat on the neck. "I see your point," he murmured. The tension in the room lightened as more recruits came forward to greet Duke, realizing the dog's mild temperament was unmistakable once you looked beyond an initial bark or big dog stereotypes. After the demonstration, Reed concluded with a reminder that training and empathy go hand in hand. "We're not telling you to let your guard down," he said firmly. "We're telling you to use your judgment, rely on the facts, not fear or hearsay." A round of polite applause followed. Mark, feeling a mix of pride and relief, thanked the group. Duke, sniffing along the edge of the briefing room, seemed to sense the friendly mood. One of the rookies asked for a photo with him, and soon half a dozen others joined, snapping pictures of the old dog who'd inadvertently become a local example of harmless misidentification. On the drive home, Mark glanced at Duke in the rearview mirror. The old shepherd mix dozed, muzzle resting on a cushion. "We've come a long way, buddy," Mark thought, from fear and confrontation to understanding and teaching. The day had been a small victory, evidence that hearts and habits could shift when people opened themselves to empathy. Still, Mark knew not every situation would end so peacefully. But if more officers took that extra moment to assess, if more neighbors paused before calling in questionable complaints, perhaps fewer old dogs and fewer families would endure the trauma Duke had faced. It was a start, and for Mark that was enough hope to carry them forward. A mild autumn breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves across Mark Winters's yard. Duke, the elderly shepherd mix, dozed by the garden fence, soaking in a last bit of late afternoon sun. Although life had steadied after the police fiasco, a restlessness lingered among the neighbors, almost as though they waited for the final piece of closure. Mark sensed it, too. He and Duke had visited the police station, the neighborhood had rallied around them, and the real stray had been reunited with its owner, yet some tension still simmered beneath the surface. One crisp evening, Mark received a phone call from a local news reporter named Jasmine Moore. She'd covered the story early on, highlighting how an old dog was nearly harmed due to a mistaken complaint. Now, with rumors swirling about departmental training reforms and the successful rescue of the real stray, Jasmine wanted a follow-up. "We'd love to do an on-camera piece with you and Duke," she proposed, her tone surprisingly gentle. "Show the positive outcomes, the changes that might be happening around dog-related calls." Mark hesitated. The idea of cameras in his backyard again unsettled him. Duke's calm days were precious. He didn't want the old dog stressed by media hustle. But then he recalled how Duke's story had sparked genuine change. Neighbors cooperating, new police training modules, and less fear toward older or misunderstood dogs. Maybe shining a spotlight on that was worth a little inconvenience. "All right," he agreed softly. "But keep it low-key. Duke is, well, not the most energetic star around." News of the upcoming interview spread quickly. Ms. Flanagan insisted on tidying Mark's yard, fussing over a few sparse flower beds. Mr. Leonard, cane in hand, joked about wanting to watch the filming from a discreet corner. "Never thought our quiet suburb would attract so many cameras," he said, chuckling. Some folks, though, expressed wariness. Would the final piece truly reflect the community's unity, or sensationalize the original conflict? Mark shrugged, trying to remain hopeful. If Detective Reed or one of the newly trained officers joined on camera, it might show real progress. "We either trust this reporter "Or we keep silent," he told Mr. Flanagan. And staying silent won't fix misunderstandings. On the scheduled day, Mark woke early, giving Duke a gentle brush. The dog tolerated the fussing with patient dignity, as if humorously aware of his role. Mark also set out a comfortable blanket in the yard, ensuring Duke had a soft spot to lounge for the interview. Mid-morning, Jasmine Moore arrived with a single camera operator, as promised. No big production van or rowdy crew. Detective Reed pulled up shortly after, stepping out in plain clothes rather than a stiff uniform. "I don't want Duke to feel threatened by all the official gear," he explained with a small grin. Jasmine greeted them warmly, complimenting Duke's calm demeanor. The dog, possibly recalling Reed as one of the officers who initially approached him more kindly, gave a slow tail wag. Mark exhaled, grateful that things already felt relaxed. The interview began with Jasmine summarizing the early crisis, a misdirected complaint, an older dog wrongly treated as a threat, and a subsequent community effort to catch the true stray. She then turned to Mark. "How have you seen the neighborhood change since everything happened?" Mark glanced down at Duke, rubbing the old dog's ears. "At first, I was angry. My innocent dog was cornered in his own yard. But after that, people stepped up. We found the real stray, helped him return home, and the police department recognized the need for better training. It feels like we're closer as neighbors now." Jasmine's camera operator nodded, capturing the yard's quiet warmth. Then Jasmine posed a more pointed question. "Some critics argue that the police overstepped, that they harassed Duke. Do you feel justice was served, or do you still harbor resentment?" A flicker of tension passed through Mark's eyes. "I can't lie. I was upset. But a couple of the officers, especially Detective Reed here, apologized and took steps to ensure it doesn't happen again. I'd rather see progress than carry resentment forever." Reed cleared his throat. "We made mistakes. We can't change that day, but we've implemented new protocols for dog-related calls, focusing on observation and verification. We're also cooperating with local rescues to handle stray complaints more humanely." He paused, looking at Duke. "This dog's ordeal opened our eyes to how easily fear can escalate if we don't slow down and assess." The interview moved on smoothly, until a voice interrupted from beyond the fence line. "How you're all praising a dog that never should have been threatened in the first place," came a man's tone, tinged with frustration. Mark recognized him, Mr. Chandler, a neighbor on the next block, known for his blunt opinions. He strolled closer, arms folded. "I get that you're trying to fix things, but this could have ended in a dead pet. Isn't that worth more accountability?" The camera pivoted, capturing the confrontation. Mark tensed. He recalled Chandler's outspoken rants on the neighborhood forum, but he also understood the man's concern. Many people had indeed feared a more tragic outcome that day. Reed raised his hands in a non-confrontational gesture. "We understand your concern, sir. That's exactly why we're here, admitting wrongdoing and establishing better practices." "We want to prevent tragedies," Chandler huffed. "We'll see, Detective. Words are cheap." With that, he turned and stomped away, leaving an uneasy silence behind him. Mark exchanged a nervous glance with Jasmine. Would the camera spin this tension as evidence that the department hadn't done enough? Jasmine, sensing the tension, gently shifted the discussion back on track. She asked Mark about Duke's health and daily routine, then concluded the interview with an optimistic angle. Would Mark or Duke be involved in future community events to promote better neighbor-officer relations? "Absolutely," Mark said. "If Duke's up for it, we'll stand by any effort that fosters empathy. We've seen how fear and miscommunication can do real damage. But we've also seen how understanding and humility can bring a neighborhood together." As the camera cut, Jasmine smiled, promising to produce a balanced piece. "I'll include the sincerity I've witnessed here," she told Mark. "It's heartening to see real steps, not just talk." With the interview wrapped, Mark crouched beside Duke, scratching under his chin. "Good job, buddy," he whispered. "We'll get through any leftover doubts together." Duke yawned, oblivious to the swirl of human politics, content to lounge near the garden fence once more. When the local news segment featuring Mark and Duke aired, it stirred a surprising wave of positivity in the community. Neighbors who'd only heard fragments of the story watched interviews of Detective Reed admitting his department's mistakes, and Mark speaking earnestly about empathy and caution. The footage of Duke, grey-muzzled, wagging tail, calm eyes, painted a vivid picture. Here was a gentle, aging dog who'd once been so close to harm simply because of a single phone call and some overzealous officers. The week following the broadcast, Mark noticed a subtle shift. People stopped him during his errands to offer kind words about Dukey, praising both dog and owner for handling things with grace. Some even asked about volunteer opportunities at the local animal shelter or inquired about the new police training modules, Ms. Flanagan beamed whenever she recounted the segment, repeating to anyone who'd listen, "Did you see old Duke on TV? What a star." Meanwhile, the station posted the full interview on their website, and it quickly gained traction on social media. Comment sections buzzed with praise for Mark's calm approach and the police's willingness to reform. A few skeptics still insisted the incident was being sugar-coated, but the majority applauded the resolution. "It's nice to see a story end without tragedy," one commenter wrote. One afternoon, an invitation arrived in Mark's mailbox from the local precinct. It read, "You are cordially invited to a small ceremony in recognition of community members who have promoted positive reform in animal-related calls. Please join us as we honor Duke, Mark Winters and others who have helped shape our new policies." Mark blinked at the thick cardstock, a mixture of emotions swirling. He recalled the fear and anger of that day in the backyard, never imagining it could lead to an honor of any sort. After a beat, he glanced at Duke, who blinked back sleepily, as if saying, "That's one more event, friend. Are we up for it?" With a soft laugh, Mark murmured, "You're the real hero, buddy. I guess we can manage one more ceremony." On a crisp, sunny afternoon, Mark and Duke arrived at the precinct's modest courtyard, where a small podium and rows of folding chairs had been arranged. Detectives and officers, neighbors, and a few local government officials mingled. Captain Ellis, who'd been leading the precinct's internal reforms, welcomed everyone with a short speech. "Today, we recognize how a misunderstanding became a catalyst for change. We acknowledge the challenges of responding to animal calls and reaffirm our commitment to handle them with caution, empathy, and respect." Detective Reed took the microphone next, recounting how Duke's misidentification spurred the department to institute basic canine behavior training and to open dialogue with local shelters and neighborhoods. He then called Mark up, gesturing for the old shepherd to join him. Duke ambled forward, greeted by gentle laughter and applause. Cameras snapped pictures as Mark, still slightly self-conscious, patted Duke's head. Reed presented Mark with a small plaque inscribed with words of thanks for his contributions to fostering empathy and understanding between law enforcement and community animals. Another, simpler plaque was given to Miss Flanagan, recognized for rallying neighbors to help find the real stray scout. Finally, the tall, stern officer who'd initially confronted Duke in the yard stepped forward. Mark's breath caught. He remembered the tension in that man's eyes, the raised voices. But now the officer's gaze held only sincerity. "I want to apologize again," he said into the microphone, voice carrying across the courtyard. "And thank you for showing us that we could do better. This plaque might be a small token, but it represents a big shift in how we think about these calls." To Mark's shock, the officer knelt and gently extended a hand toward Duke. The dog sniffed, tail wagging uncertainly but without fear. Sometimes humility takes a lot of courage, Mark thought, moved by the gesture. Among the attendees stood Michelle, the mother who'd initially phoned the police. She'd quietly slipped into the back row, her children in tow. After the ceremony, she approached Mark and Duke with a timid smile. "I'm so glad it ended this way," she said, patting Duke's shoulders gently. Her kids hovered, starstruck by the dog they'd once feared. When Duke licked their hands, giggles erupted, dissolving the last vestiges of anxiety. Miss Flanagan snapped a candid photo. Duke, Mark, the once skeptical officers, and the children who once dreaded a large dog. In that instant, the tension that had once threatened to tear a neighborhood apart was replaced by a tangible warmth, proof that empathy, transparency, and a willingness to correct mistakes could indeed mend fences. Over refreshments in the corner of the courtyard, Mark and Detective Reed discussed next steps. "We're finalizing those canine training modules for officers," Reed said enthusiastically. "We might even invite you and Duke to speak at a county-wide meeting. Show them that an older dog can be misread if you only see barks and size." Mark chuckled, scratching Duke's chin. He'll be happy as long as the treat bowl's full and the environment's not too loud. For a second, he imagined how easily Duke could have been shot or seized if events had unfolded differently. The plaque in his hand felt far weightier than its small size suggested. It was a symbol of how close they'd come to tragedy and how things could change. Later that night, Mark and Duke returned home, stepping into their quiet house. The old dog settled by a glowing lamp, letting out a contented sigh. Mark flopped onto the couch, feet aching from standing at the ceremony. "We did it, old friend," he mused. "We turned a nightmare into something hopeful." In the corner of the living room, the plaque gleamed under the lamp's soft light. The words "fostering empathy" reflected the journey they'd traveled, a single call, a misunderstanding, a near tragedy, and finally, a community united in compassion. Duke's tail thumped lazily, as if seconding the thought. They'd done something that mattered, and if every old dog could find such protection, every misunderstood situation such resolution, the world might be just a bit kinder. The gentle dusk settled over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the backyard, where Duke first encountered the harrowing confrontation weeks ago. Now, those memories of raised voices and trembling old paws had softened into a collective lesson in empathy. Mark Winters sat on his back porch, gazing at the tiny plaque he'd received from the police department, emblazoned with words about fostering understanding. It felt like more than just an award. It was a testament to how one misjudged moment could evolve into lasting community change. Duke, the old shepherd mix, lazed at Mark's feet, muzzle gray, heart still ever trusting. If he recalled the incident, he showed no sign. He simply let out a contented sigh, as if the yard was once again the safest place on earth. In the distance, children's laughter floated over a fence, and a neighbor's porch light flickered on. It was ordinary suburbia, yet the air held a quiet promise that if a dog's bark echoed in the night, people might pause to consider the context before dialing 911. The local police, guided by Detective Reed, continued refining their approach to dog-related calls, training rookies to discern real aggression from harmless anxiety. Across the neighborhood, a young mother named Michelle had shed her guilt, now championing better communication among families. And at the shelter, stories of Duke's plight and Scout's rescue were told as hopeful reminders that fear could give way to understanding if given a chance. In a final small gesture of gratitude, neighbors pitched in to plant a modest dog-friendly garden at the edge of the community park, a living tribute to senior pets like Duke, where families and officers alike could appreciate the serenity of well-loved animals enjoying their twilight years. As dusk deepened, Mark set the plaque on a side table, pressing his hand over Duke's warm fur. A gentle breeze rustled the trees overhead, and he smiled at the hush of a peaceful evening. There would always be dog complaints, always be misunderstandings. But perhaps, thanks to Duke's undeserved ordeal, more people would stand up, speak gently, and strive for clarity before fear took hold. In that contented hush, old dog and devoted owner shared a glance, unspoken proof that even small corners of the world could be made kinder when empathy and second chances triumphed over haste and alarm. If you found Duke's journey as inspiring as we did, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed or even helped prevent an animal misidentification that could have ended badly? Share your stories and lessons learned. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more uplifting tales where empathy and courage shape our communities for the better. Let's keep spreading the message that understanding and compassion can change lives, one wagging tail at a time.